Welcome back to Kent Auditorium. I trust that you had a productive morning and afternoon, and I hope that the sessions you attended are going to prove useful for you in your teaching this quarter. As I said in the morning, this afternoon's session, we're going to hear from some UChicago undergrads and hear their perspectives on being in the classroom and teaching, and give you a chance to ask them any questions you feel like, really, and get insights from them about what you're about to go into. But before we do that, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce John Boyer, who is the Dean of the college at University of Chicago. He's also the Martin A. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor in History. He's been the Dean here since 1992 and has done amazing things for this college, as you are going to see when you enter the classroom with our amazing undergraduates. So please join me in welcoming him to this session.
Thank you, Bill. No, I'm going to have to, I don't want to fight with it, so, okay. So I want to, I understand you're all going to be TAing in the college, many for the first time, is that right? So, okay. I thought I could tell war stories, but so I'll only tell one war story. When I was a graduate student, this was a long time ago, there were very few teaching opportunities for graduate students at the University of Chicago. The college was very small, less than 2,000 students. Graduate programs were much bigger. The entering class of graduate students in the history department the year I came, I think, was 65 graduate students. It was this year I think it's 18. So that the world was very different back then. And, there were no teaching opportunities at all, and Chicago graduate students had a very difficult time getting academic jobs in especially liberal arts colleges in that era, talking about the 1970s, even to the 1980s, because of they had no teaching experience whatsoever, and many of the colleges would simply not take a chance on our graduate students. In any event, I was sitting in my apartment one evening. I just finished a chunk of my dissertation, and the phone rang, and it was the chair of the Department of History on the phone. I'm an historian. I was a graduate student in history. And he basically said, hey kid, you want to teach Western Civ? And I said, like, excuse me, who are you? And I'm the chairman of the history department. I said, oh, okay. This was the old Western Civ course. It's a very venerable and famous course. It's still taught in the college in the regular year and the academic year. It goes from the ancient world to the modern world, kind of from Plato to NATO, kind of, or at least what used to be NATO. And I had gone to a Jesuit college my undergraduate college, and I'd studied Greek and Roman history, and I'd studied Latin. So they had kind of looked that up, and they said, well, this guy, he's a modern historian, but he must be able to teach ancient history because he studied with the Jesuits and he knows Latin. So they offered me a job teaching two sections of Western Civ, not being a TA, but being a lecturer. I think it was like 5 days later, I was supposed to walk in the classroom. I talked to some of the older faculty whom I knew, several of whom were my teachers, and they basically said, well, kind of good luck, sink or swim. Here's a few tips. One guy actually sat down for me an hour and gave me an hour advice, which proved to be not very useful, but anyway. And I went in, and these were UC undergraduates, and it was a different era. It was, kind of the post-Vietnam era. It was, I don't know who suffered more, the students or me, the first quarter, but we got through it, and then we got through the second quarter. And the third quarter came around, and A big part of the third quarter in the old Western Civ course was Marx, not just texts from Marx and Engels, but texts on historical materialism more generally. And it turns out that a number of the students or several of the students I had in the class had been expelled during the great sit-in of 1968, and they'd come back. We had a sit-in, you can read about that in my history of the university, rather famous event. And these people were, SDS types, and they knew a lot about Marx. They knew more about Marx than I did. And I have to say, although without getting into politics, they probably believed Marx more than I did. And so I remember we were talking about Marx, and basically they took over the class. It was kind of like a sit-in, intellectual sit-in. It was quite marvelous. At the time, it was somewhat frightening, but also ethnographically quite fascinating. At the end of the year, I remember thinking, I don't know whether they learned more than I did, but I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about teaching. I learned a lot about student life in the University of Chicago. But I learned it all in the hard way, basically, kind of being thrown into it with no preparation at all. And so you have a little bit better situation. You have a kind of modulated opportunity to become a teaching assistant, and to, whether you're working in one of our big core courses or science courses or the history civilization courses, and then presumably many of you or most of you will go on to be have your own teaching opportunities. And I guess that's for tomorrow, right? Although not for you for tomorrow, but maybe next year tomorrow you'll be at the other session for the students doing standalone teaching. So I think the point of my remarks is I think this is not something just to see as a thing to check off or to get your points or whatever it is under the GAI. I'm not quite sure what that lingo is, but I think you get some points and so forth and get paid. And being paid is nice, and getting points is nice, but the opportunity to work with the quality of the students of the quality we have at Chicago now, even back then, was really quite extraordinary. And I think you will find this year is a learning year for you, not just a teaching year for you, but a learning year for you. I think by May or by March or by December, whenever your teaching stint ends, you'll know a lot more about yourself than you did now in ways that you'll find quite surprising and I hope revealing. Teaching at the university has always been a complex thing because the university has always had very complex relationships with the project of teaching. One would think that a university, if you think of what a university is, it's supposed to be a place where students are taught and faculty teach. Formally that's the case for Chicago. But because of the nature of how we were founded in the early 1890s, coming out of the failed experiment in the first University of Chicago, which failed and went bankrupt. And the Harpers, our founding presidents, urged to create this kind of aura about what he thought was a kind of a German research university, although it really wasn't a German research university, since you couldn't really create a German research university in the middle of the United States in 1890, even with all of Rockefeller's money. But you could create segments of it. And some of his early correspondence, there's rather naive and not, I wouldn't say not hostile, but very strange comments about, well, maybe the day will come when we won't even have any undergraduates around here anymore. This will just be a graduate research university, as if there weren't undergraduates at the German universities. German universities were filled with what we would call undergraduates, but Harper was kind of blocking that out. And on the other hand, so there was this kind of not animus, but a kind of ambivalence toward undergraduate teaching, in the sense that this wasn't really part of the project of the new model, the late 19th century prestigious research university incorporated. But when they opened the doors of Cobb Hall in 1892, who ran in? Lots of undergraduates. And by the time of Harper's death in 1905, 1906, undergraduates vastly outnumbered the arts and science graduate students at this institution, even though he didn't intend that happen, but it did happen. He was a generous person, and the faculty began to kind of get their minds around undergraduate teaching, and they did a rather good job of it. And the quality of the students they recruited, I think, made all the difference, because back then, when buildings like this were built, this is one of our first buildings on campus, named after a guy by the name of Kent, who was a local philanthropist. Where would you get high quality undergraduates to come to your college? Because Harper was a proud person. and he had come from Yale, he studied at Yale and taught at Yale, and he wanted the undergraduates here to be as good as the Yale undergraduates, or Harvard undergraduates, maybe even better. And so they came up with all of these tests and all of these procedures to get in, and they set the bar very high, and so that but it was a big country and a big city, and there were a lot of qualified kids who showed up, male and female. Very important for our student culture that this was a co-educational institution then, at a time when most of our peers were not. And also that it was something of an experiment because of the quarter system and because it was new and it was in the Midwest, and they were willing to take chances on people. They admitted a lot of transfer students, people who were not 17-year-old high school graduates, but rather maybe 22, 23 who had gone someplace for a while, dropped out, taught, because back then you could teach school with a high school diploma in the United States, or at least in many high schools. And so you ended up having a very mixed population of students, old, new, male, female. The older students were very serious because they had already kind of had one bout in another college, and many of them were working their way through. This was not an elite college socioeconomically like some of the Ivies were. And so it resulted in a student culture that was very earnest and very given to taking their studies seriously. And this was made all the more the case by virtue of the fact that Harper wanted to have big PhD programs. You know, where would you get doctoral students in 1890 or 1891? Well, you'd have to go to colleges. Now, many of the colleges in the United States were very poor and very weak, and they basically had open admissions. Now it's very difficult to get into a PhD program at the University of Chicago. Back then, if you could pay your money and you weren't a criminal or something, that, you just show up and I want to be a graduate student at the University of Chicago. It was much easier to get into the doctoral programs than into the undergraduate programs in the 1890s. And so you had a lot of graduate students coming in who were very ill-prepared for graduate work, and so what they were told to do is go take classes with the undergraduates. And so that the early class structure in the University of Chicago was a rather hybridic, in the sense you had undergraduates studying with graduate students, which still happens today, and many of our juniors and seniors take classes with graduate students, and we think that's a good thing. But this also then contributed to a certain seriousness, a certain kind of adultness, a kind of academic gravitas that really, once it was set within the undergraduate student body, it kind of stayed that way for the next 100 years. And so that when I don't know how many of you went to this college as undergraduates, probably not that many, but when you were thinking about colleges 4 or 5, 6 years ago, and you may have heard of Chicago as a college, and what were they? Well, Chicago's a very serious place, a very academic place. These are the kind of rhetorical tropes that are used to describe us. That rhetoric doesn't just drop from the sky or from the ceiling of Kent Hall, but rather it comes from this decades of having a particular kind of student culture at the university, a culture that we've aimed to continue to enrich and to replicate. And the students today, I think, are very much worthy of those early students and their seriousness and purpose. So you're going to be working with students who are very, very interested in what you have to say and who will learn as much from you as you will hopefully learn about yourselves. And so I want to then say one more thing, and this is not an order or even a strong suggestion, just kind of a mild suggestion, that it would be, I think, helpful if to learn more about yourself and about your students, to get to know them outside the classroom. There are coffee shops on campus. We have a lot of them. They don't make a lot of money. Some of them actually are deficit operations. So I'm here to actually try to create business for the coffee shops. That's just a joke. Well, it's not totally a joke. It's partially a joke. In your calculus section or your civ section or your writing section in a Hume course, certainly do everything you can to help the students prosper and learn in class. But take them out for a cup of coffee. Get to know them. I think you'll find fascinating individuals, and they'll learn a great deal from you. They'll look up to you. And again, our undergraduate culture here has very much profited over the many decades by having the students interact with older students and adults, and that's you. And that's why your work is all the more important with our students. So congratulations on having being selected to be a TA, and I'm glad that you were not phoned 5 days before the quarter started and said, hey kid, you want to teach fill in the blank, but you have actually a smoother and perhaps more productive and predictable path ahead of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. All right, I'm going to invite our undergraduates to join us up front and hand the mic over to Chandani, who will oversee the next session.
Welcome back. I hope you all had an enjoyable day full of good conversations. So this session is designed to help you all understand and kind of pinpoint effective teaching strategies, assignments, activities, and attitudes that will allow undergraduates to actively engage in and benefit from the learning process, right? And so what better people to talk about that than the undergraduates themselves? So I have, just want to tell you how this is going to go. There are 4 questions that I'm going to ask one at a time to each of our panelists. They will answer, and a bulk of the session is going to be devoted to your questions, of which I'm sure you have a lot. And they will be happy to answer them as best as they are able. So with us today, we have Angela Zhang, who's a double major in visual arts and economics, who's immediately closest to me. And then we have Rochelle Koch, who's a biology major. So hopefully they can offer you kind of diverse perspectives on the classes that they've taken at the college, since they've taken many in many different fields of study. So to get us kind of started, and let's make sure your microphones are on. Yes, okay. So the first question I will ask is about organization. So how has your course assistance, organization of a course, and classroom management contributed to your learning? Whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'll start. I think with course assistance, a lot of the actual planning goes towards sort of like discussion sections or additional programming around the syllabus kind of constructed by the professor or whoever's actually organizing the class. Between economics and visual arts and other classes in art history I've taken, I think there's a really big difference. But in economics in particular, I would say probably what's really helpful that my TAs have done is in discussion sections, because we're already learning so much in each class period, a new model or anything like that. It can be really helpful to hash through those again at a slower pace a little bit. But in art history or visual arts, these are kind of like additional learning opportunities that are more like mini extra classes, I think. For example, like in art history introductory classes, you have to learn how to do sort of visual analysis writing, which isn't immediately intuitive to a lot of people who haven't done it before. So I've had a TA who kind of structured a mini lesson in how to approach that form of writing that included reading examples of that, pinpointing what is visual analysis, what's right and what's wrong, and sort of then having us practice on images she projected on a slide afterwards. So it was like a miniature lecture in that sense, but also discussion-based as well versus econ, which is more like you kind of take the questions that your students have based off of the material that was kind of hurled at us in lecture. And the same goes for visual arts, I think. People kind of take their own liberties with giving demos of certain things, like if you're in a painting class and you want to learn how to go to the wood shop and make your own stretchers, that's something that TAs will do. So I think it depends on the department you're in, whether or not it's really good to add more stuff to throw at your students or just to kind of supplement. But taking your own liberty with it and doing what you're interested in, I think, and what you think the class would be interested in is generally really helpful.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. So in the sciences, generally course assistants lead discussion sections, but something that I would really like to see more is more structured discussion sessions. And oftentimes students walk into discussion not knowing what to expect initially, like at the beginning of a quarter. So I think if course assistants made that clear in the syllabus perhaps, because it really doesn't get put into the syllabus, it's usually word of mouth. That would be really helpful, and I think students would be more prepared for discussion sections if they knew what to expect.
Any other thoughts on class management? Okay. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about are assignments, and specifically ungraded assignments. So what low stakes or ungraded assignments completed both outside of class as well as in-class work, prepared you for the graded assignments like tests and exams and papers? And then were you able to understand the link between the ungraded work you were asked to do and then the graded work?
Okay, so in the sciences, again, there are a lot of P sets usually that are assigned as practice problems for to prepare students for the exam. So there are many different ways that I've experienced P sets. I think, problem sets that is. I think that the most useful way of doing it is to have a lot of optional problems on the P set and then a few of them graded, so like a low stakes assignment as opposed to a high stakes assignment. And usually teachers seem to make it so that P sets are like a small part of the grade so students don't feel pressure to do it. But I still think that giving like a lot of problems to the students that will model the problems on the test, but only grading a smaller amount in a regular fashion, so like every week instead of like twice a quarter, is a good way of going about it. And in terms of assignments and discussion, I had a TA who made handouts for discussion himself, and it really helped us, I think, because we didn't go in like having to prepare for it, so we kind of just went in with the knowledge that we had from lecture and I guess from textbook reading, and he would let us solve it in small groups, and he wouldn't help us that much unless we got really stuck, and then he would have us present on it. So I think this really helped to not only for us to realize like what we knew and what we didn't know, but also to practice like presenting stuff. And I think all of this together really helped us solidify the knowledge that we were learning. So.
Yeah, I think in econ sometimes it feels like there aren't any low stakes assignments because everything is always graded. But definitely it's really helpful to have a lot of preparation, practice problems, or old exams to look at when you're studying for midterms and finals. And I would say, I guess the role of TAs in doing that is just helping us kind of walk through those step by step as well. I think it's a little bit different again for visual arts or your humanities courses, where I feel like the role of ungraded assignments throughout the quarter is really, really important. In classes, for example, we'll keep sketchbooks or archives of things, or we'll have to do sort of like material tests about projects we're working on, talk a lot to our TAs and our professors about the ideas behind the next thing we're gonna make, and having someone there to kind of be an accountability person almost, or just to be there to know about what you're thinking about making is really, really helpful to maintain your kind of productivity throughout the quarter. And I would say the same goes for humanities with short papers as well, because I think that's mostly on the TAs to read those. For example, I was in an art history class where every week we had to write a small 2 to 3 paragraph kind of response, and then our TA would grade that and give us feedback or say, oh, well, what about this part of it? You're missing kind of this element of that. That's really helpful in developing like a sense of how you should be writing or how you should be thinking about things in preparation for bigger papers or assignments.
All right. And then for the graded assignments themselves, so what role can a course assistant play in helping you successfully complete high-stakes assignments like exams or papers, and how does their feedback on these assignments contribute to your learning?
Yeah, I think again for econ, having review sessions is so helpful, and that has been happening like for every course, I think, because it's pretty crucial. And I think more specifically at those sessions, what is really helpful is taking students' questions at a slower pace than the professor would, because we don't really always have the opportunity to ask questions and do things at a slower pace in class when there's a lot to cover. And that has been always really helpful, and knowing how to work sort of at the pace that your student needs is really good too, because it can be really difficult. And in terms of papers, I think the biggest thing for me personally has been TAs who are really easy to approach to schedule office hours, because in lecture-based classes it can be a little bit more intimidating, I think, to go up to a TA who's never really spoken up or you've only really emailed them before. but having someone there to think through stuff has been really helpful and made a big difference for me, especially in classes like in philosophy where I don't really know anything and it's my first time reading these texts, and thinking through big ideas and getting advice about what other reading to do and stuff like that. Same thing for critiques in the visual arts major. Again, it's somebody just there who knows what you're thinking about and is like a personal friend of yours almost, to say, you know, last time I saw this painting, it was way different. What did you do? Why did you make these changes? And just to like keep you on track, I think.
So in terms of review sessions, I also think they're extremely useful for exams. I would really like to see, however, review sessions that I guess, like, again, are more structured. So where the TA comes in having prepared some material to go over that like students have been complaining about, or just is more complex by nature, and being able to like explain that to students in a more intuitive way. I think I really appreciate review sessions like that. Again, I think answering questions is important, but I've gone to so many review sessions where TAs are just, they say, okay, come with questions, and students really don't like know what to ask, I guess, or not, the whole class doesn't really benefit from that. So I think, again, having prepared material is important.
That covers all different kinds, like true, false, or longer form questions too.
Right,
just
right.
The structure of the test, I think.
Yeah. So I think also the types of questions that will be on the test are important, and I think like certain ones are harder than others. I mean, usually there's straightforward questions, and then there's the more like the ones where they ask you to take a concept and then apply it. And I think those application questions are the ones that should be emphasized, at least in science classes, because I mean, the book, you know, the textbook usually has those questions, but those are the ones that students get stuck on. So I think like we can do the straightforward ones on our own time, but it's those ones, the novel issues that are harder to do and that I think are more useful to go over. And then in terms of after the exam, definitely like after we get it back, going over it and allocating time during discussion section is really important. I know that sometimes the discussion session is too short to do that, but at least to allocate some amount of time and then saying to, you know, if you can't cover it, just that students can come to you later, I think is a good way of doing it. Instead of just saying, if you have any questions, like, come see me in office hours, and not going over it at all. So I think it's important to go over the exam.
So anything else about feedback in terms of like paper comments? So this is outside the sciences, maybe what has been helpful in terms of the kinds of comments you've gotten or the kinds of interactions you've had with the course assistant?
Well, I would just say, again, having that rapport with a TA where you've emailed back and forth a lot about different ideas or tweaks to your thesis or what exactly you're interested in writing on can be so helpful when you are even done with the paper, because in that way they sort of understood what you were trying to do, and in art as well, like the ideas you had before, and to compare that with the product that they receive gives a little bit more of like a personal feeling to it, so that they can really help you say if that was a clear execution of your ideas or not. And that can sometimes be difficult to do with professors since time is limited with them a little bit more. So again, in office hours, just having that sort of like knowledge of what your students are actually interested in doing and seeing if they accomplish that well can make it a lot more rewarding, I think, even with just core classes and papers that are assigned.
So in the humanities and social classes that I've taken, I've found that sometimes, usually it works out such that the TA or the course assistant grades half of the papers and then the professor grades the other half, and then they switch off. I am not exactly a fan of this. I guess they probably both read through it. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but usually the comments I end up getting are from one or the other. And the way that the TA grades as opposed to the professor can sometimes vary a lot, and there's like a big disconnect there, because I find myself needing to go to office hours to both my course assistant and my professor, because one wants one thing and one wants the other thing, and I'm not really sure how to put those together in terms of the way that my paper is written and the argument I'm making. So some sort of, I guess, like, I think a solution to this problem would be to get comments from both the professor and TA and to have them equally grade each paper, although I do know that, you know, time is an issue, so that's probably why they do it that way as well, so.
Okay. And then the last question before we open it up is, are there aspects of a course assistant's attitudes or behaviors that you might point to that helped you learn in some way?
So, with this one, I actually really like it when the course assistant or the professor adapts their teaching style to the student audience. So, a lot of times in these science classes, it's like pre-meds, right? And they have to take classes like organic chemistry, and they think, well, this stuff doesn't feel like it applies to what I'm going to be doing at all. And I think teaching the class in such a way that it applies to the people who are taking it is really important. For example, in organic chemistry, if you like put in a biological application of the organic chemistry, it might make it such that students are more interested in it. So this kind of teaching style I really enjoy. Another thing that I really like is when professors talk about their own research, and also course assistants can do that too, because students are interested in what the course assistants and professors are doing. I mean, it's a research institution, and usually, you know, you're interested in your own research, so the enthusiasm like goes both ways, and so I think that's also really important, enthusiasm in general for the subject, even if it's not exactly your area that you're focusing on. And another thing for science classes is I really love it when teachers do demos. And I don't know how feasible it would be for course assistants to do demos in their discussion section, but I think that'd be a really good idea. Alternatively, like maybe a trip once a quarter to like the research lab that the course assistant is working in would be a cool way to get students engaged in the subject or this related subject. And confidence is actually also really important, and that kind of goes with enthusiasm as well. Just like radiating an attitude of interest in what you're teaching makes students want to learn it, I think. And obviously, if it's your first class that you're a course assistant for, you know, you may not be as confident, but everyone's here to learn, you know, and we're all adults. And again, like no one has all the answers, so if a student asks you a question that you can't answer, like it's okay. I think like I was a course assistant for one class, and I felt really nervous about that possibility, but it's all right. And the last thing I have to say is telling students about resources outside of the class if they want to know more about the field or the subject. There are things like guest lecturers that come here all the time, places they could go within the city that have something to do with that subject. You know, the possibilities are endless, so that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I would reiterate the part about being yourself, I think. One of the really cool moments that we had in a 20th century art class I was taking was that every lecture kind of covered like one movement as we surveyed the 20th century. And when we got to the 60s and kind of like feminist art, our TA actually did that lecture for us because that's her area of study. And it was really fun to hear her talk about it and present it through like choosing which artists that she was really interested in and lecturing about stuff that she has spent like several years studying now. And it was really cool to see her be able to talk about what she cared about, and she was awesome at it, so that was really fun. Another thing is just, I think throughout any humanities or discussion or lecture-based class, it's kind of nice to hear a TA chime in at times too, instead of just sit in the corner or be the person who gives you like a check on your paper every week. And that makes you, I think, more approachable for students as well, and that's really good. I think you guys should all talk in class. And I would say for visual arts, I guess, again, what Rochelle is saying is that, you know, giving opportunities outside of school, showing what galleries you could go to or events that you're hosting, it can be really cool to foster sort of a sense of community. I know it's a little bit different in like economics classes, But again, I think the attitude for econ would just be really open to helping, or any technical classes like in math or anything. Just realize that different students go at different paces. It can be really overwhelming, and it can be really intimidating even with TAs to ask questions that you think are dumb or anything like that. So just being really aware of that. Which is like the broadest thing I would have to say, is just knowing who your students are, even if it's in a really large lecture hall. If there are people who come up to you, like, know what they're about. Big thing we kind of brought up while we were discussing what we would say during this panel also is being sensitive about any sensitive material that you would be teaching in class as well, mostly for humanities stuff. But yeah, I think it's just important to be sensitive about that. Know that your students have different backgrounds, religions, or whatever life experiences. And also, one thing we brought up too is just knowing pronouns as well. So all these general things about making your learning environment a really comfortable one and open one for all your students.
Yeah, I also just remembered names are really important. It makes students feel special. And on top of that, when you call on your students by their names, the students themselves can also know their names of their fellow students. So I think it's good all around.
Great. Okay, so that's all of my questions for the panelists, and we'd like to open it up to all of you. We'll do the same thing we did this morning. Maybe Bill or Joe can help me run a mic up this way. So just raise your hands if you have questions, and we'll come to you with the mic so that you can get more information.
So a part of my section will be devoted to covering the material that the professor goes over during the lectures. And I'm debating what approach to take when reviewing the material. One thing I was thinking was to do like a mini lecture and focus on the important, perhaps complicated pieces. But another approach could be to perhaps create a handout which has some questions about the important pieces and give it to the students and have them work in groups and then present. So of those two, or perhaps the third one that you can think of, what has been the most effective for you when the TA is discussing or going over the material from lecture? In the psychology, I'm in the psychology department.
I wonder if there's like a hybrid of both that could be helpful, I think, yeah. Because if it's something challenging in class that you think maybe needs a second time around to teach again so that it's a little bit clearer, I think it can be really helpful to make students break it down on their own and sort of teach it to themselves, and that like teaches it in another way, I think. But if it needs review as well, I wonder if there's a way to go over it briefly and then have it broken into different segments or aspects of that concept and then go over it all together, like piece it back together again afterwards.
Yeah, I think obviously a hybrid I think would be the best solution for that, but if you had to pick between one or the other, I'd probably pick the handout because it engages students a lot more than getting spoken at passively. But again, if they're so confused that they can't do the handout, I feel like that doesn't make sense. So.
I know that in our Soc class, one time or a few times we were separated off into groups and assigned different sections of that week's reading. So each group became really familiar with a certain aspect of an argument. And then when we went all around the classroom, we all kind of put that all together. And the TA or the professor's role in that effort was kind of clarifying each individual element and also how they were connected. So that's also really helpful, I think.
Hi. My question, I have two questions actually, and it's just about what the shape and size of a course feels like on your end. So in a typical social science or humanities course, I'm curious about what's the reading load like for you guys, and where have you bumped up against, say, the lower end of it, where you say this doesn't seem challenging enough, and the upper end of this is absolutely too much. So I kind of want to get to that. And the second question is, what's the digital imprint, for lack of a better term, of a course that you're taking as an undergrad? Do you just interact with a course via chalk, or are there other ways that you interact with a course? And I guess I'm also asking, are there good ways or bad ones, ways that technology has helped you or fallen flat?
So your first question about the size of, I guess, like readings and such in social humanities classes. I want to say it ranges from 20 to 50 pages per class, but it really depends also on the type of reading that we're doing. Oftentimes, like, certain authors can be more challenging than others, and it seems like my professors try to scale it accordingly, according to the difficulty. But I think, like, once it gets to about like 100 pages or so, it gets to be too much for one class. And I do remember one of my teachers, it was for a psychology or a human development class. And she assigned a lot of reading from different sources, and all of it was required. And so I ended up skimming all of it. So I think, like, maybe not making all of that required and making some of it optional is definitely a way to go about it, because otherwise students might just feel so daunted that they don't do it at all. And then your second question about interacting with the course via technology, I mean, I think Chalk works pretty well in terms of, I guess, online quizzes. I've had those. I don't mind those. I think they're a good tool. And then in terms of putting stuff up there for students to have, like handouts and PowerPoints and things like that, I think it's pretty useful. I can't really think of much else to say about that.
Yeah, I would add on to the first question about reading too, that something that I've really preferred throughout my classes is a mix between textbook reading or larger text readings and shorter essays or articles that are also really important. So that mostly applies, I think, in art history, but also excerpts from certain writings for philosophy and also the core classes as well. So having sort of maybe like 3 to 4 essays per class and 2 chapters of a textbook is usually like pretty standard for art history, I think. And when we're doing larger novels in Hume and Soc, it can be a lot, but I think usually if, I don't know, I don't know how you guys really choose how much we read, but it always seems to be about standard, like across all of the core classes, I would say, like at a standard pace, like X number of books that we cover over the quarter and 2 weeks on this or 1 week on this. Yeah, and I would say about the digital stuff, I haven't really run into issues, I think, digitally. The biggest thing is probably discussion posts on Chalk or submitting our papers on Chalk. Besides that, the only things I've had is maybe a statistics book or like econ textbook that's online instead, and that's pretty convenient, I think, generally. Like everyone kind of likes that too.
What do you think about policies regarding laptops or tablets in class? I'm a little older, and so back when I was an undergraduate, we had big clunky laptops, but people didn't tend to bring them to class. So I don't know what, I mean, on the one hand, people like them to take notes, but on the other hand, people are checking their emails. From a student's perspective, do you think it's helpful to allow them or not to allow them, or to have some kind of policy that splits the difference?
An age-old question, I think. But I do think it's really helpful to have PDF copies of things because books cost money, and yeah, I mean that's always like the pro laptop argument. I think, yeah, usually in a smaller discussion class you can't get away with like not talking if it's 12 people around a table. I've had some professors who did no laptops, only tablets, and I'm like, I'm not gonna buy an iPad so I can read a PDF, you know. So I don't know. I think it can be personal preference, and as students, like, we understand either way. I think it's really on you guys to, like, what you feel comfortable with. I think we're fine with.
Yeah, I took a Soc class, and I found that like half the class would use laptops and half wouldn't, and usually most of the reading was in paper, so it wasn't really necessary to have a laptop. And personally, I thought it would have been better if no one had their laptop out, just because it feels more engaged. Like everyone feels more engaged as a class. Like if you know, everyone's like, no one's hiding behind a laptop screen. But in terms of big lecture classes and science classes, I mean, I've had professors who have actually like said no laptops, no cell phones even, because you know everyone knows that everyone has their cell phone out. But I think for those kinds of bigger classes that aren't discussion based, whatever the students want to do, I think they should be able to do. I find that most of the time students are taking notes in notebooks and not really on computers. I mean, for things like physics and organic chemistry or general chemistry, like it can be hard to take notes on a computer anyway. And I think it's the student's loss if they're going to waste time on their laptop instead of pay attention to the teacher. So that's what I think about it.
I think I'm pro laptop, actually.
Hi, do you have any thoughts about best practices for office hours, when to hold them, where to hold them, and what's the kind of best way to engage with students in office hours for you?
I think it depends on the department a little bit. Like in paper-based courses, having one-on-one time is really important. And I know that in economics, where it's sort of going over the same assigned questions on problem sets, that can work in groups as well. Yeah.
I think in terms of timing of office hours, I've had TAs or course assistants that have done their office hours very late at night in the basement of the reg, and I never really want to go to those office hours because late at night I'm in my pajamas in my bed, not wanting to think about homework after using my brain for the whole day. And second of all, it's the basement of the reg. So I think, I mean, clearly, like I know that some course assistants don't have their own office, so the library is an option for them, I guess, as a location. But in terms of timing, I think like late afternoon is a really good time for most people because like classes tend to be in the morning. At least I feel like a lot of people schedule it that way, and it seems like most people can make that timing. And usually they're, in terms of location, they're usually in the course assistant office, but the library is an okay location.
I have to plug for coffee shops because I work at one. I know Dean Boyer said something about them earlier. So student-run coffee shops, they're tables, you can grab coffee and talk. They're great, but also I think one thing that TAs will sometimes do is ask at the first class if their time works for the students or not, just to get a feeling. Like if 40 out of 50 people can't make it, then maybe you'll find another time that works or something like that.
Hi, I'm wondering whether or not there's something specific that you think a TA can do or has done to encourage students to come to office hours, and I'm particularly thinking that, perhaps students who most need to come because they're shy in class and need strategies for feeling more comfortable talking in class won't come to office hours also because they're shy. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or from experience, friends' experiences, things that helped them.
I think in terms of making students a little more comfortable, I think that would definitely make them more eager to go to office hours. Because oftentimes students don't go to office hours because they're intimidated, even if they know they need it. Because I've had course assistants where you ask them a question and they're just like, oh, that's easy. And you're like, but it's not for me. So I think being really receptive to students' anxieties about the class and addressing those verbally would be really helpful. And really, I think that just once a student asks you a question to take it as it is and not to make the student feel like they're stupid for asking it.
Another thing we had in my seminar class for art last quarter was that if you weren't comfortable speaking in front of the class, you were actually assigned to write a written response and email it in, I think, before class about the previous course's readings, which is a pretty good incentive to talk in class, I think. So maybe that's an option as well. And I think, if you make it, you don't ever want to target someone for saying, you never talk in class, your participation grade is going to go down. Instead, it was sort of like, to anybody here who feels that way, please email me. And then sometimes it'd be like, oh, you didn't email me, do you have something to add right now? So I think maybe as a policy, instead of a targeted thing, it might be less scary for those students who are not as prominent of speakers in class.
And one more thing I have to add is when you help the student out with a problem, for example, doing it in a way that would help them do other problems is a really good way of doing it. I think oftentimes when we're in lecture, we learn something very conceptually and we don't really learn how to do the problems related to that topic. So I really liked it when course assistants have gone over the material in a more concrete or practical way.
I know both of you are very talented, but suppose you or one of your peers was having trouble in a class, and you have two options. You can go to the TA during office hours, or you can go to the professor during office hours. What and how would you choose which method to do, and which one would you prefer to do, to go to the TA or go to the professor? And what did you find most helpful if you went to the TA versus the professor? If you could possibly share those thoughts.
Well, I can give a pretty personal account, I think. Sometimes I feel like if you're really struggling in a course or you have a really heavy course load one quarter, and you feel just too behind to go talk to a professor, you'll go to the TA, I think. And I've definitely had to do that before. So I think the most powerful thing about having a TA in a class is that it's an equally valuable resource, but also maybe without the judgment or the implied intimidation of it. I think that's really important and pretty universal among students.
Yeah, I think personally I actually go to both. And I think it's because the TA and the professor have different perspectives on the material. The TA definitely, they usually know what you're doing in your problem set, so they can concretely address, what you're having trouble with. But I think professors are also, office hours are important, professors' office hours, I guess, in the sense that professors sort of have a bird's eye view on things, and even though they may not know exactly what you're working on, they can, some of them, and some of them don't do this, they can empathize with you a little bit and try to give you more general advice about how to tackle the course. So.
So I'm going to be a TA in a course, and our professor is sort of debating whether or not to make the discussion sessions mandatory. So I'm just going to ask you, and please be 100% honest. If the discussion session was optional, it was not mandatory, would you go?
What department are you in? Okay, that's pretty cool, I think. I don't know. I think all of my discussion sections have been mandatory, but yeah.
Well, being the ambitious pre-med that I am, I do go to optional discussion sections, believe it or not. I've gone to discussion sessions that are 2 people because it's optional, and honestly, I like those better because then I get all the attention. So I think I definitely go to optional ones, but it seems like most people don't. However, that being said, I have had optional discussion sections where people actually do show up because they're extremely useful. So what happens is usually people show up on the first one, and then they kind of gauge whether it's useful or not. And if it is, they usually end up coming, and if not, they usually don't. So it really, I think, is up to you. If you're doing a good job, then your students will show up. If not, they will not. So.
So I'm kind of curious about meltdowns. I've witnessed a few of these happen actually on campus already, and I was just kind of curious. Both of you guys seem really together with your stuff, and I'm wondering, in those kind of situations, either from your own personal experience, if you're willing to share that, or maybe from your experiences with friends or others that you know who have gone through them, when a student melts down in front of a TA, maybe crying, really upset, whatever else, what do you envision what would you like a TA to do in that position to be helpful?
I think I might have melted down in front of a TA before, and I think, again, it's sort of you have this person who is senior to you and there to help the professor teach you and make sure you're learning and your grades will reflect what you learn and everything. But I think maybe if you're in this situation where a student is really panicked about like a test the next day or something like that and they freak out, I think the right thing to do is be comforting to them and not be too strict, but at the same time, I think it's still not really within anyone's power to say, oh, you know, there's nothing you can really do concretely besides be supportive and say, you know, let's look at this holistically. How does this impact the overall course and your grade, and how can you, you know, plan around this, and just take a deep breath, I guess. I think that's what I would really like, someone just to be supportive, but yeah.
Yeah, I think another thing that I would do if I were a TA and a student was melting down in front of me, I would ask them why, you know, or like what is it that's like bothering them, you know, because it may not be related to the course at all. They may be doing fine. So I think just getting them talking is really important. And usually when you figure out why you're crying, you usually stop crying. So that's probably how I would try to comfort the student. And again, talking like, you know, if they are actually struggling in the class and that's why they're stressed out, talking about their options and being very like straightforward about it is a good way of going about it, I think.
I'm wondering whether you'd be willing to talk about maybe one or two things that would cause you to lose respect for a TA.
Yeah, I think a few things about certain TAs I've had negative experiences with is that we'll have a problem set that's due this day, and then the week after that it's supposed to be graded. And sometimes they wouldn't be done for like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, which on the quarter system can be really, really difficult to manage, since, you know, we have like finals and we get our P-set the day before and we wouldn't know what we did wrong on them. So that's a big one, and I know that can be frustrating because you guys are so busy, but same with papers, I think, short papers, just to know where we are and how on track we are. And another one, which we sort of briefly touched on earlier, it's so okay if like you don't know the answer to a question, and it can be really frustrating when in a discussion section where we're preparing for a final that you like go on about options or ways to do it for like 20 minutes without answering it, and then in that period of time we could have gone over 2 or 3 other questions like successfully. So I think just being honest and then also like on track with all your work and stuff.
Yeah, the amount of respect I have for a TA depends on the amount of respect that they have on me, for me and their students. So I think obviously, yeah, we spend a lot of time trying to get our things in on time, like our problem sets, you know, on time. So if you can grade them on time, like by a certain, like, you know, before the next one, I guess, and regularly, like not doing one really fast and then grading the other one really late, I think really helps. Like setting a routine and sticking to it for the sake of the students, I think is a very good way to keep respect with them or build respect. And I hate to say it, but I tend not to respect TAs that don't seem as knowledgeable about the matter or the subject being taught. And this usually doesn't happen here because, I mean, it's the University of Chicago, and it seems like, I mean, I've met very many very talented course assistants who really know the subject well, but every now and then I come across one that it seems like I could learn more from a textbook than from, you know, by asking them. And that I generally tend to respect them less, I guess, when I realize that. But that doesn't happen very often, so.
Just to add on that last bit, though, I would also say I really don't like it when TAs act like they're a lot better than us, too. So just, like, be nice as well, even if you don't know, if you're not, like, the top in your department, as long as you're willing to work with us, and I think you care about like making our learning experience good too, or offering whatever help you can, and being nice while doing it means a lot too, because if you're rude, I don't think any undergrads will like you.
Yeah, humility is important, but confidence is as well, just don't overdo it.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
So grade inflation is an issue that's talked about a lot in the world of college today, to the point where in a lot of courses, the most common grade is an A at this point. So are undergrads ever concerned about grade inflation, or are you generally the beneficiaries of it and in favor? And what role, if any, do TAs play in this phenomenon?
Well, our school doesn't have too much of grade inflation, so I don't know if, I don't think TAs necessarily, I guess in terms of grading sometimes with problem sets versus exam scores, which are always very like deflationary, I think, or not generous often. I think it varies by department too, I would say. But I don't really feel like anything has been particularly unfair at all across the departments I've been in.
Yeah, I think most of the time I receive the grade that I probably deserve, and then I usually feel that way too. I'm like, I think I deserve that grade. But every now and then, at least I've heard of a course, which I will not mention as its name, but where I think there's a lot of grade deflation in that course. Deflation. So that students are getting really low scores, where like I don't really know what the average is generally set to in classes, but that specific class has a really low average. But other than that, I think most of my classes have been graded fairly well, where the students get what they deserve.
Yeah, I don't think there's much of an issue of inflation because a lot of it is graded on a curve where the average of a test will be like 60% or even 50%, something like that. And then it'll be curved to the discretion of the professor, like to a B- or to a B. So it's usually not, I think, in the TA's role to decide the grading schemes as much as just to follow what the professor has set or what is sort of standardized across a department.
Think of the best TA you've ever had, and if you can tell me, what points did they show that made them the best, not merely good?
I had a really great TA in the art department who I feel like was there for every student and really interested in all of our work. It was in a painting course, and there were times where I would just, talk to her in class about what I was thinking or about changes I had made or things I was struggling with, just very conceptual things. And she was always very open to discussing that. One time it was really awesome in class. I was just working and she came up to me with this book and it had all these John Constable paintings of clouds. She was like, "This really made me think of you. You should look at the way he works with light in all these drawings." And it was really cool because it was sort of something that she knew I'd be interested in, and it wasn't necessary of her at all to do something like that, but I felt like there was somebody in the classroom besides our professor, who's also great, who cared about what I was doing and the work that I was producing, and also she really pushed me a lot. She never let anything pass that went unexplained, I think, in every single move I made, and that was really cool.
Yeah, I think my favorite TAs have been the ones who've always come to discussion really prepared and really enthusiastic, and they want to know all their students individually, and they truly care about their students. So you can really tell when a course really doesn't care about their students and really does care about their students, and it shows. Students can feel that, and it becomes a sort of mutual relationship, and that also increases the amount of students who come to office hours generally.
On the note of grading, in some courses such as chemistry, you receive fairly low grades throughout the quarter. There's usually fairly low averages for tests, maybe in the 50s or 60s. But then at the end of the quarter, those courses are curved up so that the average is maybe a low to mid B. How do you feel about that sort of grading scheme in terms of motivation and your personal investment in the course and your interest in the subject?
So personally, I think that a 60 or a 70 as an average score is where I guess I'm not surprised if that's the average. But I think like it's really demoralizing when the average score is, say, like a 50 or a 40 or even a 30, because then it's like, even though everyone, like, I guess did badly, like, everyone feels really bad about how they did, regardless of how they did, like, in relation to the class itself. So I think like there's sort of a balance you have to strike between like the ceiling effect and having too many people getting like 90s versus like everyone like in the gutter like getting like 30s and 20s or something. So I think like, I guess 60s and 70s, I think I have found like most teachers tend to aim for that range as an average. And I've been pretty happy with that because you usually get students who are like at the top of the curve getting like, 90s in that area, and then there's students that aren't like more at the bottom. But I think generally students are pretty content when the grades are around there.
I think it can just take some getting used to coming from high school into like a first year course where a lot of students have gotten straight A's through all of high school, and suddenly they get like a 57 on a test. And then it ends up being a B, and they're still upset about having a B. But I think it's something that we just get used to, especially at our school, and how deflationary grades can be. But I don't think it's necessarily demoralizing unless, yeah, the average is like a 20 or 30%, and then at that point it feels almost like, why are we doing this, or making it so difficult that it's not really productive for anybody. Otherwise, I think it's pretty standard.
Yeah, the other thing I would have to say about chemistry classes is, again, like lots of pre-meds take it, and pre-meds love to complain, and they all want A's. So I think like it's kind of just a fact of life, and there's going to be a lot of complaints about that. So.
Okay, join me in thanking our undergraduates for I think especially for your honesty. We appreciate that. So I have a couple of reminders, and then I will tell you all where the reception is. So as you're starting to teach CA for the first time, we wanted to remind you that we have a new series called the Fundamentals of Teaching series, if you don't already know about it. And they will be happening the first 4 weeks of the fall quarter by discipline. So please go to our website. It's under workshops and seminars, and you can find a list of all of the ones that we're offering. And you can go ahead and register. There is space available, and I think all of them. The second thing is probably early next week you'll receive a survey from us asking for your feedback about how today went. This is the first year that we've split this program into 2 days, 1 day for course assistants and 1 day for standalone instructors. So we would really value your feedback so that we can continue to make improvements and continue to work towards making this program as beneficial for you as possible. And lastly, we'd like to invite all of you to our reception. It's going to be held in our brand new CCT space in Wiebolt, the 3rd floor. It's kind of hard to find, so I suggest you find a staff member to walk behind. We're all going to the same place, and I hope that you can all join us there. Thank you for your participation today. We hope you had a great time, and we look forward to working with you again.